Today we're going to talk about chapters 19 and 20, but we're limiting our discussion to injuries and fractures, part 1. The reason for that is, as you get into this chapter, you'll notice that in addition to coding the injury, we also have to code external causes, which is chapter 20. So I think it makes more sense to do them side by side, and I encourage you to get in the code book as soon as you can and start to look at all the specificity. When the number of codes in ICD-10 became published, the primary reason why there are so many is the laterality, the right and left sides of the body, and the specificity, the exact point in the body where the fracture has happened. The documentation that I have given you to code is very, very specific because that's what we're shooting for, but be aware that in the real world you may not find that specificity. Therefore, your codes are going to be less specific. And over time, your clinical documentation coordinator, or whatever CDI, whatever her name or his name is in your facility, is going to be working with the doctors, trying to get them to read that x-ray in all its detail and document accordingly so that you can code to the highest specificity. I also have changed it up a bit from the way we've been doing these chapters because of the number of guidelines. I decided in this podcast I'm going to list the guideline, I'm going to give you an example of that guideline, and then we're going to code it just the injuries, and the next slide will be adding the external cause codes. You've been coding now for quite a while through this semester, so I expect you to be able to find these codes with a little bit of guidance. I strongly encourage you to save the PowerPoints, which you can download from the content page, print them if that's what you need to do so that you can review them for the test, as well as just how to know how to code injuries and fractures. And I also suggest that you would cover the answers and try to find these codes on your own so that you can do so if you were asked to do that on a test. All right, let's jump in. Our first slide has to do with Chapter 19, an overview. Chapter 19 uses the S section, S as in Sam, section for different types of injuries related to single body regions, and the T for Tom section to cover injuries to unspecified body regions as well as any burns, poisonings, adverse effects, complications of care, different consequences that are caused by something external to the body. There's an instructional note at the beginning of Chapter 19 which tells us to use secondary codes from Chapter 20 to indicate the cause of injury. Those Chapter 20 codes are never the principal. So your injury code is going to be principal and your Chapter 20 external causes is going to be secondary code. There is also an instructional note at the beginning of Chapter 19 advising the coder to use an additional code to identify any retained foreign bodies, if that's applicable to the case that you're coding, and that is a Z18 point dash code. Chapter 19 has extensive inclusion and exclusion notes, which makes for very long and complicated code descriptions. It's important that you take the time to read those, because otherwise you are going to be breaking some of those excludes one notes. Fractures make extensive use of the 7th character value, which is a lot more detailed than what we've done so far in this course. Thus far we have looked at A for initial encounter, D for subsequent encounter, and S for sequela. Many of our codes are going to be far more detailed than that now, and you will be finding that little pink box that advises you which 7th character choices you have just after the category code. So whatever the alphabetical index takes you to a code, for example, S52.111, you are going to go to that code, but you're also going to look back at the S52 category to see the little pink box and what options you have there for 7th character. you know in an injury code you're going to be using that seventh character. So it's important that you only use the options that are available to that specific code. This is an example of an image that I took off of Google Images, just to remind us of the types of bone fractures we might read about. I encourage you to look at Google not only for the bones, but to also see the different parts of the arm. This is an example that I'm taking here where you can see the radius bone, that if the palm is up, the radius bone is on the outside of the arm. And then you can see the anatomy of the elbow. You can see where the radius fits into that elbow joint. There's so many images on Google Images. I don't want you to get lost in them, but I think it's an important review for you. You can also use your anatomy textbooks. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Chapter 20. There is an index of external causes just after the table of drugs and chemicals. If you recall, there's an alphabetical index, then the neoplasm table, then the table of drugs and chemicals, then the index of external causes. You may have put a tab on it in the very beginning of the semester. If you go to Chapter 20 in your code book, there's a list of blocks that tells you what's contained within this chapter. And under transport accidents, which is quite a large category, there's a lengthy instructional note that defines the different transport vehicles. I mentioned a little bit earlier, and just a reminder again, to always look at the beginning of a category to be sure that you are only using the seventh character codes that are an option for any specific code you're using. In Chapter 20, it's only certain codes that use a seventh character. In Chapter 19, almost all codes use a seventh character, but not all of them. External cause and morbidity codes are used with injury codes to provide information about how that injury occurred, what caused it, was it intentional or accidental, if you know that, and the place it occurred. The status, is it a military person or a civilian person? Was the patient working when he or she got hurt? Were they in the military but on their off-duty time? All those status statistics are kept by the hospitals, reported to certain entities. Who knows why? I'm assuming they use them to report on how often people get injured when they're working in a certain field or doing a certain activity. Speaking of activity, when an activity contributes to the injury, there's an activity code, category Y93, that is used to describe the activity. These external cause codes are assigned based upon physician documentation. If the physician does not document external cause information, coders can use documentation from non-physicians. But if there's ever a conflict between what the physician is saying and what the non-physician is stating, then we have to use the physician's documentation as our source. The assignment of the seventh character for the external cause code should match the seventh character of the injury code. There are times when that is questionable, and I think when we get our next code updates, October 1st, 2016, some of those things are going to be taken care of. That's what I'm hoping anyway. And when that happens and I'm aware of it, I will definitely make you aware as I code these. There is a hierarchy when you are sequencing external cause codes, and this is the way they are ordered. A code for external cause for child and adult abuse takes priority over all other external cause codes. The terrorism external cause codes takes priority over all other external cause codes except child and adult abuse. Cataclysmic events like a hurricane, tornado, flood, blizzard, storm, those types of things, takes priority over all other external cause codes except for child and adult abuse and terrorism. So do you see how this hierarchy is ordered? The transport accidents take a priority over all other external causes except child and adult abuse, terrorism, and the cataclysmic events. The first listed external cause code should correspond to the most serious diagnosis that's due to an assault, accident, or self-harm following the same order of hierarchy. I have to depend on you to go back to your coding handbook and review these in great detail. I cannot in a podcast spend a lot of time on them because they just get too long. But here is the case in point where you just need to make sure you go back to the coding handbook and read these. The first coding guideline I'm going to refer to is the application of the seventh character. I've given you a diagnostic statement here. In purple, I have highlighted what happened, how he got hurt, and his injury. And I have, in the coding column, just given you the injury code. The path and the rationale is there on the right. And then on the following slide, I add those external cause codes, where the cause was a fall from the balcony, place was at the student's home, at the child's home, and the activities roughhousing with his friends. So this gives us all of our codes now, our injury code and our external cause codes. And here's an example of that seventh character we talk about where it's not D, as in subsequent encounter. We've got more information given to us. The top diagnostic statement, the radius is healing but not as quickly, so you're going to get a delayed healing code. And then in the second diagnostic statement, it's a non-union, which is a different code for, a different seventh character for subsequent encounter for fracture with non-union. Coding of injuries, I've highlighted in purple all the terms that we will be using when we code this diagnostic statement. As a reminder, I encourage you to try to find these codes on your own, either covering up the answers in the pathway so that you are definitely sure you know how to do that. So here we have the injury codes for this particular diagnostic statement. I explained to you why I chose the characters that I chose. And here is the same scenario. Now we're highlighting the external causes. Driver of a motorcycle with an accident occurring on a state road. Thank you for your attention. Watch out now for injuries and fractures part 2.